Friends, in the previous episode, we discussed about Ashoka the Great. Today, let us discuss another great. And again, as per the modern civilizational standards, we have another great man, that is Alexander the Great. So let's discuss particularly his so-called victory against Porus. We are all aware that Alexander had left from Greece with the intention of conquering the world. He set across, he wanted to avenge certain Persian defeats in the past. So he defeated the Persian Empire and then marched on to India. Now, it's commonly said that, accepted that he had won the war against the first Indian king that he faced. And then, of course, there is a lot of narrative that's woven around it. You know, Marshal Zuko, a World War II veteran general in the Russian army. He was once the chief guest at the Indian Military Academy in 1957, and while addressing the newly commissioned officers of the Indian Army, he first mentioned that this whole narrative of Alexander winning against India just seems like a lot of balderdash. That it's quite made up and it doesn't sound rational at all. And he likened it to the fact that he says just because Hitler reached up to Stalingrad, if world history said or declared that Hitler won the war against Russia, how erroneous that would be. And he likened Alexander's declaration of victory in the same erroneous fashion. So let us today examine in more detail, because actually Alexander lost the war to Porus. Let's see why and how is that possible. So to start with, there is no archaeological record of Alexander anywhere. The only archaeological records we find is through some of the buildings that were set afire in Persepolis in Iran, and having got burnt and baked, they were retained for posterity. So we do know that something like that happened. And then a lot of coins that were found later with his inscription. So we know that there was an Alexander. So in that, of course, there's no doubt that there probably did exist one. No issue about it. And then, of course, you have to depend upon textual sources to see what he did. You know, textual writings and references here and there. The first textual reference about Alexander that is available to us is 450 years after his death. Now, if you look at how we have textual references of things happening today itself, and you have so many versions, imagine having a textual reference which is 450 years after his death. And now that reference is citing certain other works. And this reference is by an author called Aryan. He's supposed to be an historian of that time. And he has referred in his textbooks. He's also mentioned about Diodorus, who wrote a book about 250 years after Alexander's death. And he, of course, called Diodorus a total liar. And Aryan himself was called a total liar by Pliny. So, you know, because these historians have put in a lot of exaggerations here and there, so it does seem like that. But still, we can check them out and glean through them and find out what exactly may have happened. And Diodorus, of course, depended a lot upon Megasthenes' book Indica. Megasthenes had written that probably 20 odd years after Alexander's death, because he was an ambassador to the Magadhan court, a diplomat there. So let us first understand that the textual references are very much after the death, a long gap, and a lot based upon hearsay. So precise commentaries about how things panned out exactly are not all that clear and are not all that trustworthy. But anyway, let's just go by what they say. First and foremost, having won over Persia and got all that wealth to himself, Alexander was now a very rich man. He arrived on the borders of India, and at first he encountered Ambiraj from the kingdom of Takshila. Ambiraj had a long-standing fight with Porus, the other king, and Ambiraj made a deal, or rather Alexander made a deal with Ambiraj that once I defeat the next kingdom, I will of course take all the wealth and I'll be the overlord, but you can become the governor of that region. Plus, as per their records, they gave him 25 talents of gold. Now, each talent, as per Greek talent, is supposed to be 1,000 kilograms, which means 25,000 kilograms of gold is what he gave him, because he expected to get much more than that from India, or at least his first Indian kingdom. That was how the deal was made, and then both these armies then crossed over the Indus and then came across to the banks of the river Jhelum. The Jhelum was supposed to be in Spate, and yes, somehow Alexander went upstream somewhere, crossed it over, and then surprised Porus. I believe it rained the previous night. So as a result, what happened was that Porus' elephants were getting stuck in the mud and the sand, and that is why they lost the war by noontime. How ridiculous. You know what? India in those days was like a superpower. Because if America today is a superpower for about 200 odd years, India had been the foremost civilization for almost 3,000 years by that time. So they were a superpower, a powerhouse. And those guys were adept at using elephants and all these war machinery. The elephants were concerned like the armored division of what we have today as battle tanks. And if you think that you did not know that your elephants could actually get stuck in the wet sand, is very high school textbook story. Is not really meant for historians. Anyway, they give that kind of a thing, but then it is known that the Alexander's army was totally in disarray on the basis of these elephants, because they didn't know how to deal with them. An initial few elephants got impaled by their long phalanxes and those spears and all, but then the next waves came and completely threw them aside, because it would lift the guys and present it to the person sitting on the elephant to chop him into pieces. It created terror in the ranks. The other terror that the Greeks had of Indians was that the Indians had tall, long bows, which is almost 6 feet height, which is almost their own height. They will hold it by their foot and then they will pull it to the extreme, and then when they release the arrow, it was said that there was no breastplate on earth that could shield you from those arrows. It would pierce any shield, any breastplate on the planet. This is how powerful those arrows were, and they were very, very scared of those. To add to it, the Indian steel was far superior. The steel with which you make swords and all, far superior to the swords that those guys had. Furthermore, before he even set out, he knew the Persian legends that even though the Persians were an empire and they attacked Greece many times and they humiliated them in the past, they had tried the same thing on the Indian side, but then an Indian king, what he did to one of their kings was only 4 people and the king returned back to Persia. That's how ferocious it was. So the Persians never touched the Indian side after that. This is the legends. So it was that kind of a force that this man had come up, and in that too, a small little, a decent kingdom on the border country of India. So what happens, this is the condition of the battle. Another thing that they have noted is that Alexander's favorite horse, all the way that came from Greece, was always there with him. His favorite horse, Bucephalus. This Bucephalus was killed in the first half an hour of battle. It sometimes says that he was slain by Porus's brother or Porus's son. Either way, later on in the battle, that person died. But then Alexander's horse was slain, and Alexander lost 2 of his generals. In none of his campaigns earlier, he lost any general. But here, he lost 2 generals. And are you telling me Alexander was not furious because of that? That he became so enamored by one statement from Porus, treat me like a king, that he not only gave him back Porus, but he also returned Takshila to him. That means he became the governor of Takshila too. That means Takshila came under Porus. How does that happen? He is your ally with whom you made a deal. He fought the war with you. You win the war, and then you give away your ally to him to be overseen just because you got impressed by some statement and his bravery. That is just trying to make Alexander the Great, because Alexander never called himself great. Later on, historians had to make him a European great, you see. Now, to make him great, you have to show his character. So they had to show his character of being a very benign guy. I mean, Alexander, the kind of tortures and massacres and murders that he did all along the route, including in Persia, does not actually sit with the character that they try to show once he reached India. Okay, so here in India, he lost his favorite horse in the first half an hour of battle. He lost 2 of his generals soon after that, and the elephants and the swords and those arrows and the archers are a terror to them. So in all probability, they lost the war. Now, as would happen when you lose the war, is that Indian kings usually did not pursue a war till its very end where they decimate everybody. Especially if the king is captured, they let him go if there is promise of good behavior. Because in India, I think honor is very, very important. Now, like we were an honorable civilization. We are not from barbarians who will not understand or trust anybody. Here, it was a very humane society. So, in all probability, Porus had a deal with Alexander wherein he decided to spare him and the remainder of his troops. But Porus knew that if he let him go back by the route he came, he is going to reassemble and attack again. Now imagine, if Alexander won the war, shouldn't he have gone back from the same route? Because he would have been showered with the red carpet and golden petals all along the route, because that is his victorious path. Why did he not go back by that route? And then secondly, they say his army rebelled, saying that they were tired of fighting any further. Frankly, are they really tired? When you're at the gates of the most richest country on the world, you get tired? You get homesick? And that too in an army where it's already there in their own documents that they usually replenish them continuously. The army is rotated in the sense there's always a contingent coming in from Greece, replacing some of the guys who've been there in the battle, and then those guys go back. A small core might remain right from the beginning, his key people. But rest of the army is being rotated. So what makes them so homesick? Nice yarn to be spin. Then these guys actually are retreated up to Indus, or they go down the Jhelum, and either way they go down into Indus. Jhelum meets Indus down the way. So these guys went down there and then went down Indus. Even there they encountered even smaller kingdoms of the Indians. And one of them, the Multans, they even today credit themselves to have killed Alexander. You know why? Because Alexander was fatally wounded there in one of the battles. His soldiers immediately were able to rescue him, and 6 months later he died with that wound, because I believe the wound was on his lung, and every breath that he took after that was like a knife cutting into him. That's how severe the lung wounds can be. So he had actually been taken back, and 6 months after reaching Babylon, he died. But then the Multanis, who were known as Malavs at that time, again an uncanny resemblance to the Meluhas that the Sumerians called the Indus Valley people. But then the Malavs still pride today, the people from Multan, that we were the ones who slay Alexander. So Alexander went back from there. Why did he have to go from that route? Can you tell me? Because he goes down the Indus, then his army breaks up into two. There's one half which tries to take the sea route back to Babylon, to the Tigris River, and then they have no skills of navigation. The other half goes to a desert, the Jedrosia Desert. Maybe it is named after the Gwadar port that is currently the belt and the Silk and Belt and Trade Route Initiative of China. It ends at the Gwadar port. So maybe that is why the region comes that way. But the Greek stories, the Greek text refer to it as the Jedrosia Desert. And through running through the desert, Alexander lost more troops in that retreat than that he lost in the entire campaigns from Greece to India. So he lost more people. Is that how a victorious army returns? It's a retreat, but of course the Greeks won't claim it that way. Why will the Greeks not claim it that way? Because when they set out thinking they will never go unconquered. They'll never face defeat. Because remember, back in Greece, Alexander was not a Greek, he was a Macedonian or a Macedonian. They actually call themselves Macedonians. So this Macedonian always had this tussle with Greeks, real Greeks, homebred Greeks who looked down upon them. So this upstart, to go back as defeated, would have been very, very disastrous. So they actually lied and said, oh, he won it, and then he decided to give the kingdom to him, and he became very magnanimous, and then he went down further, conquered some more, and then whatever, and then came back, but then died on the way, and whatever it is. After him, the generals divided themselves, his whole empire, into themselves. This is how they tried. And have the Greeks never lied? No, the Greeks did lie. In the past also they did. In order to win a political battle in Athens, they once tried to claim that they won a battle somewhere else, which 2-3 days later came to become the first fake news in the world. That was the first fake news they spread to show that they had won some battle just because they wanted to win some political battle in the Senate in Athens. So there have been those references where the Greeks were quite capable of lying to themselves. So this is possible. So right now, if you look at all these things put together, and in the end, 20 years later, when there is a diplomat who is there in a Mauryan court, so-called Mauryan court, he mentions that there is another great kingdom to the west, and that is the Paurva kingdom. Why will he call that a great kingdom? And he says, I spent some time in the court there. So why will he call it a great kingdom if at all the Paurva kingdom was defeated by them? He says another very great kingdom, obviously because they were defeated. And then he refers to them again as having spent some time there. So these are all indications that Porus never lost, because in the Indian annals there's no mention of it. In their opinion, there's a Greek upstart who came, one afternoon he lost a battle and then he was sent back, finished. There's no big mention in the Puranas or anywhere about some guy who came in great. And in any case, the whole Greek influence, even though these guys went back and they had some bordering relationships and whatever, that whole Greek influence died down within 7 years. So that tells you what happened. So the real league, the country, and the one small kingdom of the country of India at that time were able to stop this Greek conqueror all the way. But how does history tell you? It tells you the entirely different narration. All I'm saying is, you can go for that or you can go for this, but do always stand back to check and see how things are. And maybe you have a better understanding of what really happened. For the sake of your school examinations, you might want to write whatever, but then this is how you need to question and understand history, compare all the textual sources and see what really happened. Great stuff. Again, we enjoyed this small story. Thank you so much for listening to me. Guys, please support and subscribe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.